Good evening. My name is Samadha Jain, and I'm a researcher at Indic Researchers Forum. I'll be a host for the session on the silent genocide of Bangladeshi Hindus. For this session, our esteemed speakers are Professor Madhav Das Nalapat, Professor Ayon Bhattacharjee, Mr. Samir Kalra, and Dr. Richard Benkin. We also have Mr. Parag Bhalerao as a session chair. Mr. Parag Bhalerao was born and raised in Pune, India. He currently lives in the United States of America, working as a senior vice president in the IT industry. Mr. Parag holds master's degree in science and MBA in HR and marketing. Since childhood, Mr. Parag has been fascinated by spirituality. Inspired by various writings of Dr. P.V. Vartak, Mr. Parag took an initiative to explore scientific knowledge in various scriptures. He has published many articles online and 2 books, and Sir is an Indic scholar. With this, I would like to hand it over to Mr. Bhalerao to take it forward. I would also like to request the audience to kindly switch off your microphones and share all your questions and queries in the chat box. We will be answering them towards the end of the session.
Namaste and good evening. This has been a great privilege for me to chair this panel of esteemed speakers today. I welcome all of you. And before we start the session, just as a brief background of the topic that we are going to discuss today is focused around genocides of Hindus in Bangladesh. Now, these genocides are not something that started today. It has been going on since partition or even before partition, right? So, for example, Noakhali genocide, we all have heard about it. That was around 1946, and it laid right after or right around the partition discussion. And that time there was a horrific communal violation. Communal violence. On October 10th, there was Kojagiri Purnima, Sharad Purnima. The Lakshmi Puja was going on when Muslim mobs, they launched a coordinated attack on Hindu communities. These assaults involved mass killing, forced conversion, rapes, looting of Hindu properties, destruction of Hindu properties, temples, and so on and so forth. Just in that one day alone, it is estimated that more than 5,000 Hindus were killed. And lot more were forcibly either converted or displaced. This violence continued even after that. Even if you remember in 1964, there were riots. Those were sparkled with some local activities, which led to forced conversions and looting. In 1971, during Liberation War, Hindus were again targeted by military as well as various allied groups. The estimation is that time in 1971, between 3 lakhs to 30 lakh people were killed. And majority of those were targeted Hindus. And additionally, about 8 million Hindus were forced to leave and migrate to or move to India. These attacks are continuing. Recently, we are hearing again a lot of challenges the Hindus in Bangladesh are facing. Even in 1921, again during Durga Puja, a lot of Hindu temples and homes were attacked, leading to again several deaths, conversion, displacement, rapes, so on and so forth. And all these issues are becoming extremely violent, extremely sensitive, not just for Hindus, but entire humanity, humanity across the globe. So today we have a panel of esteemed speakers who are going to address certain aspects related to these genocides. So first of all, we'll start with Professor Madhav Das Nalapat. Nalapat sir is Director of Geopolitical and International Relations, and he is also Editorial Director of Sunday Guardian and ITV Network. He is a Vice Chair of Manipal University Advanced Research Group. He has been editor of Times of India and editor of Mathrubhumi. Dr. Nalapat writes expertly on international affairs and appears regularly on global media as a respected authority on geopolitics. Today, Dr. Nalapat is going to speak mostly on Western media's whitewashing of Hindu genocides in Bangladesh. So, over to you, Mr. Nalapat. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. As you correctly said, it is Manipal University that I am proud to be associated with since about 1999. And at the same time, I'd like to point out that thank you very much for having invited me here. And you're right. You were talking about the genocide before partition, and that genocide, I think it is called the premier or some of the province, Shahid Surawardi. He was very complicit in it. He joined the genocide very actively, and yes, the intent, frankly, was to send Hindus across the border into India. And I mean, those who were left behind, uh, there were a lot more deaths during that time for a simple reason. There were a lot more Hindus during that time. There's no other reason. Uh, and of course, Mr. Surawardi did not pay any price, any accountability whatsoever for his actions. He actively encouraged the mobs, and he was a political leader. And unfortunately, the whole thing happened. And the media, of course, the Western world was silent at that point in time, as it is silent now, mostly about the genocide in Bangladesh. Now, so far as genocide in Bangladesh is concerned, it is, in terms of scale, smaller, but in terms of intensity, as severe as what happened in 70 during the 46-47 period. It's very severe, and Hindus have been hunted down. Hindu homes have been attacked. It's been horrible, frankly, during that period. And the Hindus are mobilized, but I think a lot more geopolitical support is needed. And I think in 1971 also you saw the same situation happen. And it's almost a repeat of 71 in the sense that the Awami League and Hindus are being targeted. Now, again, the Awami League and Hindus are being targeted. Hindus, of course, are much more in number. And the effort is to stamp out the Awami League. And the effort is to drive whatever Hindus are left in Bangladesh, whoever are left across the border into India. It's a human tragedy. There's no question about it. I don't believe that there should be any discrimination on the basis of religion. I certainly don't believe in violence on any basis whatsoever. And quite frankly, it is an excuse. But here again, I'm sorry to say, we have a Nobel Prizeman presiding over this particular issue. And I think he will have the same fortune as Surawardi did, escape completely unscathed from his complicity in the genocide, at the very least looking the other way when this is taking place. So I just want to say that that is a very apt comparison that the chairman made. And of course, we can talk again about 1970s and 71, where the Awami League and the Hindus were targeted. Many Hindus were members of the Awami League. And of course, a similar situation happened. An exodus took place to India. Now, quite frankly, if you ask me, Sheikh Hasina had a role to play by not playing a role. Over the last 6 years of her rule in particular, I'm sorry to say, she turned a blind eye to the activities of several of the very extreme organizations that finally moved against her when they were strong enough. It's a lesson for all leaders. You play with extremists, they will bide their time and they will strike you. The Americans played with extremism. Oh, it's not happening in America. What does it matter? And 9/11 happened. Now you have the Canadians and Justin Trudeau doing the same thing with the K group. We should not call it the Khalistan group. Khalistan is a glorious name. They don't deserve to have that kind of dignity, even in a name. So the K group, and that is happening now. And I think just as the United States regretted looking the other way, and I remember before 9/11 happened, there was a religious site very close by, in fact, to the Capitol, the US Capitol. And my wife and I, we went there. There was a sermon taking place, and it was really interesting to go there. And we found a preacher from some location in the world, not an American, saying the most vituperative things about America, saying the most horrible things about the American people. And essentially, we stayed for about 10 or 11 minutes, basically saying that this country, this people do not deserve to exist. This was a very short distance away from the capital, the US capital. When I had my meeting, I told them about this particular thing, and they laughed it off. They said, no. Of course, Jack Snyder of Columbia, at that point in time, when I told him that, watch out, New York could be a target. The day before 9/11 happened, he told me, New York is as safe as anything. It will never be a target. Never. Well, the next day, his words failed to come true. So this is the problem that we are facing. And the problem is the short-sightedness of leaders who don't acknowledge that violence and extremism is terror. And anywhere it is a danger to people everywhere, especially when it's active in your own backyard. So I think from that point of view, and frankly, what's happening in Bangladesh now, it's not just the Western media. Apart from the Indian media, I've seen very little media anywhere in the world that is talking about the genocide. Most of them are celebrating Muhammad Yunus and other things and celebrating the fall of Sheikh Hasina. As I said, I mean, her father had a legacy, and in her case, I think she outlived her welcome for 2 or 3 reasons. One is that I have a theory that by the time the third generation comes around, public get a little fed up of dynasty. In India, you would say Rajiv Gandhi fought, yes, but it was not a pro-Rajiv vote, the sympathy vote for Indira Gandhi, the second prime minister for the Nehru family. Rajiv Gandhi, was the beneficiary of that. So Hasina has obviously been promoting from within the family her son to take charge after her. And when that happens, people react. Secondly, of course, she tolerated this extremism for a long time. And finally, when they were strong enough, they never forgave her for giving them cover. They never forgot that their mission was to rid Bangladesh of her and the Hindu community. And above all, they could not forgive her for being friendly with India. I mean, they absolutely hated India. So when the time came, when they were strong enough, and Sheikh Hasina, as a consequence of her lack of action in certain fronts, including in dealing with corruption, including in dealing with extremism, including in dealing with the economy, had become very unpopular. And yet she tried for a fresh term. At that point in time, a lot of genuine people joined in that. And that was infiltrated by extremist elements who took over the movement. And we have seen this happen multiple times. You have a mass movement, initially a mass movement. Then what happens is that extremists take it over And then after that, they run things their way. Iran, for example, there was a mass movement against the Shah of Iran. There's no question about it. 75, 76. But then what happened? It was taken over by extremists, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. And unfortunately, they took complete control of Iran subsequently. And there was a massacre of the moderates, which followed. The very moderates who had joined hands with them against the Shah were butchered, if I may say so, because they were regarded as enemies of the kind of ideology which was propagated by Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, I'd like to say, I've said it multiple times, I want to say it here, I don't associate that ideology with any religion. It's a fringe ideology, which unfortunately is masquerading behind a religious cover. But extremists are extremists. They have no ideology. They have no religion. Certainly religion does not exist for them. It's absolute, total extremism. And you've seen that happen in Iran. You've seen that happen in multiple places where you have extremists taking over a movement and after that controlling the situation, quite frankly. So I just want to say that what's happening in Bangladesh is completely inexcusable. There's no question about it. It's unfortunate that Western media, frankly, they're in love with Mohammed Yunus. He's got all the right credentials, Nobel Prize man, X, Y, Z. And Sheikh Hasina went after him. I never used to believe that he was guilty of the kind of activities that Sheikh Hasina was alleging against him. But after seeing what happened after he took over, I'm beginning to believe that possibly, in this matter at least, Sheikh Hasina was right. And they have this, and the problem is getting a narrative across. Now, in our own case, in India, we are living in a subcontinental situation. You have a situation where in Afghanistan there is no minority, no Sikh, no Buddhist, no Hindu, virtually, almost none. In Pakistan, Hindus are minuscule in number, absolutely minuscule. And in Bangladesh, the population has declined dramatically and has declined every year of Sheikh Hasina's regime after the first 2 years of her regime, declined dramatically. At the same time, the focus of world attention is on India, a country where you've got more than 200 million members of the Muslim community, many of whom are making a significant contribution. And you have about 30 or 40 million people of other faiths. It's absolutely absurd that the focus of attention is basically on India, if I may say so, because this is a country where, this kind of activity absolutely does not happen. But the narrative is entirely about India. There's nothing about Bangladesh. There's hardly anything about Pakistan, hardly anything about Afghanistan. In fact, it was handed over to the Taliban on a platter. And now I'm sure those who handed it over were well aware of what the Taliban's credo was. They're well aware of it. And we are seeing that kind of credo play out in the Middle East, for example. If you look at the charter of Hamas, if you look at the charter of Hezbollah, they are very, very clear. It's not just the state of Israel that has no right to exist, although it very definitely does. The Jewish people, implicitly and explicitly, often explicitly in charters, in documents, and of course, in their writings and appearances, have no right to exist. We have heard that before in the previous century. And I think the Israeli government is very clear that that kind of a situation should never happen a second time around. I think it's important for us, this is the contribution towards that. It's important for us to go before communication channels, spread the word about what's happening in Bangladesh. Go ahead with case studies, because I can tell you our narrative is not getting space. And if you look at the way the online world is basically governed, you will find that algo writers, algo warriors are very significant in that. And very often algorithms get created in which extreme views get propagated and views which are positive about India get pushed down. Negative about India get prominence. These are algo warriors who are committed to this kind of a battle in favor of extremism, a battle against moderation. And this is something that I think we all need to take note of, and we need to basically ensure that we are keeping a close eye on it, because otherwise online space today is being dominated by algo warriors who are giving completely false narratives about several situations, whether it be the situation in the Middle East, whether it be a situation regarding Ukraine, where a narrative was immediately created that Russia was going to basically, and wanted to annex Kiev in 3 days, and they wanted the whole of Ukraine, capture it. When they wanted the Russian territories that have basically left the control of Kiev in 2014, they wanted to retain that. And when it was felt in the Kremlin, correctly or not, that the Ukrainians were planning an assault to recapture that territory, they moved. And of course, you've got a very unfortunate war. People have died on all sides. But again, the narrative is completely one-sided. Now, you have individuals like Elon Musk who are in touch with Vladimir Putin, and that's considered to be a bad thing. You have a complete blackout of Russian media, television, etc. You have a complete blackout of Western media, television, etc. in Russia, and you have a complete blackout of Russian media in the West. I don't think it's a great thing that they're so comparable in such aspects. So far as the West is concerned, there are multiple constituencies in the West. And I think, frankly, several constituencies are becoming aware of the actual factual situation that's taking place in the subcontinent, the factual situation that's taking place in other parts of the world. In Ukraine, for example, if you check my writing, I've been a skeptic from day one about the war that is being waged by Mr. Zelensky. And I really thought that in April 2022, he would settle down to peace talks. Prime Minister Modi had pushed for that, and he's constantly been pushing for that. At that point in time, Putin could have been persuaded, and many hundreds of thousands of lives would have been protected from death or from terrible bodily harm. And the country of Ukraine could have been rescued from the torment that it's now going through. So I want to say it's an important battle that we are fighting. I'm completely with you in this battle. It's a necessary battle that we are fighting. We may seem a candle in the dark, but maybe there are others with candles waiting who are ready to light their candles up when they see our little candle, and the flames in the dark, in the flame in the dark. So I think the candle that has been lit by the Indic Society, by Yashash and his friend, by Dr. Bhalerao and others, that is a very, very, what I would call, that could be a very important component in more such candles coming up. Because remember, the forest fire, the fire is destructive of negativity, can start with a single spark, as they say. And we don't know which spark is going to be that spark. And it's important for us to keep those sparks flying, to keep generating those sparks, so that finally the right narrative comes out. And in that effort, I'd like to say, I think we are doing something which is beneficial to the whole of humanity. It's not simply, we are not simply fighting for the Hindu faith. I've been happy to say that I am a Sanatani from birth, and I'm proud of it. I think it's a very noble dharma. But at the same time, being a Sanatani, there's no negativity about other dharmas, so long as there's no negativity in them about my dharma. That's important. You can't have a situation in which you are talking peace, and the other chap pulls a gun on you. If the other chap pulls a gun on you, you need to pull a gun faster, so that the other chap cannot do any harm to you. And I think we have to keep that in mind. And finally, I would end by saying something about this Vasudeva Kutumbakam idea. As you know, it was part of the Hitopadesa. And the Hitopadesa talked about a fox, a deer, and a crow. And the fox was trying to tempt the deer into its lair. And the crow was warning the deer, please don't do it. It could, the fox wants to eat you up. And then the fox said, Vasudeva Kutumbakam. We are all members of one family. So what's the harm in your coming to a member of your family's lair? So remember the context always of what we hear and what we speak. If you don't remember the context, then tragedies get repeated. What's happening in Bangladesh has been a continuing tragedy, but the tragedy of 1946-47, the tragedy of 1970-71 is being repeated now. And I congratulate you for standing up and fighting it. And you're standing up for all of humanity. Because let me tell you, there is no humanity unless there is a real the humanity in humanity. You're inhuman, well, you're technically part of humanity, but you're not really in the mainstream of humanity. The mainstream may not look like much now, but we have to make it the mainstream. So I want to say, I came on board this particular meeting basically to transmit my very strong support to what you're doing and conscientizing the world about this. And I pray that the spark that you have created will be the spark that lights up a forest fire, that destroys the kind of evil demons who are in human form and who are doing what they are doing in Bangladesh. Thank you very much. Namaskar. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind. Thank you so much, Dr. Nalapat. Couple of things that you said are very, very interesting. These activities are not limited to India or Indian subcontinents, right? Those are widespread across the globe. And we can see such activities and traces and initiatives in different parts of the world. So we cannot say that, okay, it is happening in Bangladeshi Hindus. I am safe in India. Why should I worry about it? Because sooner or later, it is going to come and hit us if we don't proactively take actions and be prepared for it. Just one quick question, and I'm going to ask this question probably to all the panelists as we go through. But in your opinion, Professor Nalapat, as an individual, what can I do?
Well, I'd like to say that what we can do and what needs to be done, if there is extremism anywhere, it has to be fought and defeated. Now, you have this in the Middle East, for example, you have this axis of resistance. Israel is methodically going about dismantling that. And that is an existential threat to Israel. We are facing existential threats in India. And we have to understand that the way ahead is in dismantling those threats. And very often, those threats will use diplomacy as a tool to lull us into a sense of complacency or to basically buy time for themselves. We have to understand there are certain forces that are absolutely implacable, that you cannot please. Sheikh Hasina did not get that message. As I said, over the last 6 years of her term, she flirted with the extremists. And look what happened to her. She's now, we don't even know where she is in India. and the only country that would accept her. All the countries that talk about human rights, human freedoms, human values, none of them accepted her, except India, of course, because we have a certain culture over thousands and thousands of years, and that's exactly why we did so. But I want to say very clearly that whenever we see this kind of hatred, extremism, and you can sense it in people, and you sense that intolerance, let me tell you that it's something that has to be fought, and it has to be shown through results that that kind of extremism does not pay, that it will fail. Whether in any part of the world, such extremism will not pay. And I think that is a lesson for us in India. And I would like to say, I fully agree with you. What is happening today in Bangladesh could well happen in India, and some parts of India. Some episodes are taking place that are very disturbing. And I honestly feel that each of these episodes needs to be taken seriously, because when you have this kind of flame, wherever it is, it can spread in a lot of places. So the point is zero tolerance to extremism and to the politics of hatred for another, to that kind of individual. And if that individual does not, change his or her way of thinking and way of action, which in many cases, when you cross a certain border of extremism, you're beyond conscience. I think, Dr. Bhalerao, we have to understand this is an existential struggle. And why I say it's a struggle for all of us as human beings, this is a struggle for the humanism in human beings. And that is at the root of Sanatana Dharma. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful discussion, very insightful, and we sincerely appreciate your time. One small related or slightly unrelated, but as an individual, we see that the forced convergence are primarily on two tracks, right? Some activities are by providing them some wealth or some facilities, extra facilities, and pointing out that you will get these facilities or benefits only if you convert. And then the second is forced by using, like in Sama Dama Danda Veda, it is either Dama or Danda. So as an individual, as a society, if we discourage discrimination, racial discrimination, which is really not a Sanatan concept, but if we take active actions or be cognizant and reduce our involvement in any racial activities or discrimination, that can give some sukoon, so to say, or some comfort to certain communities and help them to face or overcome these attractions or forced measures against Hinduism. And also, we understanding our culture, our literature, our heritage, we take very minimal effort as a society, but that also can be an important activity or important aspect, I believe.
Yeah. Dr. Bhalerao, the fact is, at least 6,000 years of Indian history need to be studied in depth. Frankly, the education system that we were left with focused on around 400 years, and tangentially on about 600 years before that. And the entire period before that was basically called myth. Now, I mean, it was not myth. I have been to Ram Setu, and I'm quite convinced it was a created and not a natural formation. You have Lord Ram, and I am quite convinced that the Mahabharata took place, and yet we regard it as myth. So my point is, Alexander is celebrated by the Greeks, not just the Macedonians, but the Greeks. The Greeks have taken him over. Julius Caesar is celebrated by the Italians, correctly so. And I feel that, Lord Ram, in whatever way you choose to describe Lord Ram, for us, Lord Ram is Lord, is the Lord. But you can describe in any way, existed. So I think this, mythologizing of history has got to end somewhere, because people all over India have to be proud of Indian history and our history. When I talk about Indian history, I don't talk about 300 years or 400 years or 600 years. I talk about 6,000 years. And anyone who is proud of that, I think, will understand that this is a country with a very, very ancient past that has maintained its civilization through millennia in a way that no other civilization has thus far. The Chinese civilization, frankly, after the Communist Party came to power, they took a wrecking ball to that civilization. Now, we have the most extreme situations happened in India. And even after independence, frankly, the system of pedagogy, education, etc., was not satisfactory. But that tradition is alive. And I want to close by saying, for me, the hope in India is very clear. I have been to villages several times, and when you go by, I used to go by train when I was much younger. One sight at night that used to enthuse me was the fact that there were lights burning in temples, and I knew, passing that area, that they were very poor people. There were no lights around. There were no lights in the houses, but that light they kept burning inside the temple. I think that is a sign of why exactly our civilization has endured. For me, the fact that you've got these lights as you cross in a train, nowadays, of course, there are a lot more lights, but in those days, there were very few lights when I was much younger. And the thought of those lights kept burning in a situation where people had no lights of their own. I think, Dr. Bhalerao, that gives me confidence. Our civilization will endure.
Namaste. Thank you so much for wonderful insights. Thanks for your time and participating in this discussion today. And this topic actually is a good segue for me to introduce next speaker, Professor Ayon Bhattacharjee. One of the aspects, we'll talk a little bit about his academic credentials and other activities that he's involved in. But one of the important aspects that he is expert in is Indian knowledge system. So in ancient India, what technologies were there? What is the Vedanta philosophy? He has extremely good knowledge about this topic or these aspects. Professor Bhattacharjee is a physics professor in NIT Meghalaya. In academic field, he has done significant research in soft matter physics, quantum dots, and nanotechnology. He has held several important positions in educational administration, including Dean for Faculty Welfare, Dean for Research and Consultancy, and a Registrar. But today he is going to provide his insights on the horrors of partition of Bengal and aftermath or after effect. So it was not just an incident that, okay, the separation happened or partition happened. It had or it has longing effects post-partition. And Professor Bhattacharjee is going to share his thoughts, his views, and shed some light on that aspect. Over to you, Professor Bhattacharjee. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Parag. And it's my pleasure that I have been invited here. And, following the talk by Professor Nalapat, where he said that we need to know the history very deeply. Because if we do not know the history is going to repeat. we need to be very, very secure about our past to be secure about our present. Now, why, as you just said, I'm a professor of physics. But my other thing is, when the partition happened, my grandfather had to migrate to India, leaving behind the entire setup. He had to adjust to a new setup out here in India. Now, it happened to me. During my academic career, I had applied for jobs, and I landed up in Bombay for an interview, and I was told to give my permanent address. And my father was a government servant at that time, so I was staying at a quarter, and I put that address. And the immediate question was, why should you give a permanent address like that? It's a government quarter. Where tumhara gaon kidhar hai? Where is your village? And I didn't have an answer for that. And that's what triggered me into the whole thing, this research that, and then I found out it's not me alone. We are millions in numbers who have been uprooted from the land that belonged to us. And we are trying to find an identity for us. Now, if we want to look at the partition of Bengal, I think we need to go back a little bit, say British rule and even before that. Say, let's start with the year 1700. 1700 was the year when Aurangzeb had given the Diwani of Bengal to Murshid Quli Khan. Now, that time, Bengal was a very large province. It consisted of Bihar, Orissa on the western part, and then whatever we have in leftover as West Bengal, Bangladesh, and Assam on the east. The entire thing was Bengal. Now, what Murshid Quli Khan did was, that time, roughly, you can say Dhaka was the capital. Murshid Quli Khan, within 4 years, shifted the capital to Murshidabad. Of course, made by him with his name. Now, what that did was it created a disbalance. The original Bengal had two important ports, Chittagong and Kolkata. And Dhaka was somewhere between the two. When it shifted to Murshidabad, it was more towards Kolkata, and the eastern part got neglected. Now, slowly what happened is all the businesses shifted towards this side. And then in 1854, that was when the Bengal Presidency was formed. Now, what happened was, we need to understand here that the history that we have studied, East India Company came, they took fought the Battle of Plassey, Battle of Buxar, and established their rule. But the way history has been presented to us, it seemed British had come here for only CSR activities. They built the railway lines and got education for us. But we need to understand here that we had the Bombay Presidency, the Madras Presidency, and the Bengal Presidency. And each of them had a lieutenant governor. So these were like regional managers of the company fighting against each other. And the basic motive was profit. So with that mindset, what happened is they were exploiting the people. And Bengal being such a large province, what happened is the east was getting less and less importance compared to the western part of the province. And moreover, if you look at the topography of Bengal, it's made up of a lot of rivers, and in monsoon floods are very common even now. So all this and the imbalance in development, all that was going on. in 1866, what happened was there was a famine in Orissa, and that killed around 1 million people. And after that, what happened? There was this Governor General, the Lieutenant Governor, I think, Sir Stafford Henry Northcote. So he tried to investigate what is wrong, and then he said that administrative anomalies, and that's when that first partition of Bengal got rooted. People in the administration, they were pushing forward for the splitting of Bengal. So what happened is in 1874, Assam got separated, and when Assam got separated, along with that, 3 Bengali-speaking regions got attached to Assam. They were Sylhet, Gwalpara, and Kachar, 3 districts. Now, okay, that was there, but still substantially, like Assam was under Lieutenant Governor, and then this setup continued, but they still were not satisfied with the administration. And then came in Lord Curzon. Lord Curzon took it up as a challenge, and 1905, the first partition was done. Okay. Now that when it was done, the majority people rejected the partition. Hindu-Muslim unity was forged in, though the partition was very, very, very critically, the areas were selected that one side was Muslim dominated, the other was Hindu dominated. But anyway, that said and done, that was more or less cancelled, annulled in 1912. First episode gone. Then we come to the freedom struggle, and then as we go through the freedom struggle, we find that therein elements crept in which used religion, because that was it's very easy. You have a personal desire to be the ruler of a country or a state, and you use religion to gather people together, indoctrinate them, and then get to your ulterior motives. So that was actually happening. If you look at the history in that, say the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s, yes, of course, this Direct Action Day and Noakhali, everything happened. But even before that, things were slowly boiling up. If you, I think 1929 or so, Muslim Guards, Indian Muslim League, and parallel to that, Indian Muslim Guards were Muslim National Guards, actually. It was created, and they were really inspired by the Nazi model. They declared them as a quasi-military force, paramilitary force, and they got a lot of, more than 50,000 volunteers they could recruit. Okay, though it was officially disbanded in 1949, it came back in various forms later. But, this was done. Then, meanwhile, if you, Professor Nalapat had already said, Suravardi and people like his Khwaja Nazimuddin, Abdul Hasim, those were the leaders, the Muslim leaders, who were trying to gather people together using religion as the biggest binding force. Whereas what was happening is we were, in India, there was this concept of non-violence and all that. Though, if you look at Bengal, early warning signs were given. If you look at the works of Raja Ram Mohan Rai, in his first book, which is called Tufat-ul-Muhaddin, he wrote about it. Then Raja Ram Mohan wrote again to in 1923, he had written an appeal to the king in council. There also he had written about this, that groups are gathering together, they are slowly mobilizing people, but it was never taken in seriously. If you look at the writings of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, he also wrote that in book, it was the outline of history of Bengal, and that book was edited by John Marshman, probably. Okay, so these were the kind of things which were going on. But I think just as this time, we were silent watcher. From the Indian perspective, if we see what was happening in Bangladesh this year, many of us were taken by surprise, because we did not try to look beyond what was happening. What happened as a student uprising, that was actually hijacked by people who were ready to take the movement to themselves. And that's why you see, Eunice has been put there, and the kind of atrocities that are getting reported. But again, if we look at the atrocities that are happening here, it's not new. In 1971, it's the same thing. In 1947, it's the same thing. And what have we learned from this? Like, are we ready to protect ourselves? That is a question we need to ask. Like, since I'm interested in this, I have asked stories to a lot of the elderly people who had been migrants, both in 1947 as well as 1971. 1971, about 10 million people had to migrate to India. That's an estimate, maybe much more. And when they have come to India, you will find that what is their acceptance? If you go to Bengal, they are still classified as Bengal. In Assam, Bengal. And every state in northeastern part of the country, you have certain names for them. And that's why these people, they are not really associated with any place. They're migrating to other cities, Bangalore, Pune, Gurgaon, wherever they can, and they have established themselves there. But when you look at the horror stories, these are, very, very horrific. I was talking to a person, and he was just narrating me that his uncle, his Chachaji, he, during that 1971 war, he was just going somewhere. Some people got hold of him. They took him to a big banyan tree, and with hammer and nails just stuck him to the tree and left him to die there. So these were the kind of very, very violent incidents that got repeated. Yes, then another narrative that I have heard, these people who have been indoctrinated, they have a sequence of things to do. And in colloquial Bengali that they use, they have told about 4 things: Beti, Mati, Lathi, Khuti. Beti, the woman in the house, the most vulnerable people. So once you know that in your family the Beti has been targeted, what you do? You either marry her off to somewhere very distant where these people will not get near the lady, or the next option is You try to secure yourself, you try to protect yourself. And sometimes, in order to protect the ladies, people are bound to sell their land. So therein comes in the Mati aspect, the land. So the land gets captured. Once the land gets captured, the violence becomes easy. So the Lathi factor comes in. So the Lathi dominates. And, when violence dominates, it's very easy to get the power. Power, that is what they call as the kuti, the pole position. So this has been a colloquial narrative of things. When the people who have been separated from their lands, when they have come to this side, okay, they have now it's 3 generations, 4 generations in India. But if we look back, even today, the borders are very, very porous. The exodus is still in. Search in Twitter, you will find that there are videos. They have made tunnels, and people are coming into India even now. It's not only refugees, infiltrators who are coming here only for the purpose of earning money. And of course, indulging into activities that are not very desirable. From the Indian side, we hear that smuggling is going on. We hear a lot about cattle smuggling. But if you look at Bangladesh and just make a Google search, you'll find that hardly 15 sugar mills are there in Bangladesh. Do you think 15 sugar mills can support the population there? Every day, tons and tons of sugar are smuggled from India to Bangladesh. And who does it? It's the local businessmen out here who belong to any of the communities, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, whatever. But people are doing it. And the only motive is profit. A bag of sugar this side, when it crosses to the other side of the border, it fetches you twice or thrice the amount. So, with petty things, we are jeopardizing our security. The other problem that what I presume, which India might face in future is, event which is something like what happened in Israel. Easy infiltration has led to, the involvement of cheap labor in many sectors of Indian industry and Indian society. If you look at the security guards in your society, please try to find how many are there who claim to be from Assam, and particularly the Kachar district of Assam. You might be really surprised by the numbers. Since I travel and I am used to the dialects that are spoken, I was astonished that in very posh societies, I've heard people speaking in those languages. So once, you have given your security to an infiltrator, the infiltrator knows everything about the building you stay in, the layout of your society. So in a vulnerable situation, this would be very, very, it's an information that is very valuable to the enemy and very, very, which makes you very vulnerable. So we need to be aware of things. Getting an Aadhaar card, not a very big deal. I've seen people with Aadhaar cards, and you can make out these people are not from India. So we are, at some point, we have not learned the lessons that we deserve to learn from history. So I'd like to end by making this appeal that please, nowadays information, there's an overflow. Please get to the sources, know your history, and slowly, please try to understand how secure we are. Because if we do not secure ourselves, we cannot depend on others to make ourselves secure. So with that, I'll bring my initial part of the talk to an end. And I hand it over to Mr. Bhalerao.
Thank you so much. That was very, very insightful. And a lot of these incidents you have seen or experienced firsthand. But there are thousands and thousands of such stories that remain untold. And the impact of that on that family, as well as their future generations and society in general, is huge. So we appreciate you being here and sharing your experiences, your thoughts, and your perspectives. It was very insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
With that, we'll move on to our next speaker. Now, next speaker is a highly qualified, highly intelligent person, Mr. Samir Karlaji. Mr. Samir is in US. He is a managing director of policy and programs and co-legal counsel for Hindu American Foundation. He has worked on a range of legal advocacy issues, including religious accommodations, First Amendment rights, hate crimes, human rights, Hindu phobia, so on and so forth. He also oversees local, state, and federal and international policy initiatives of the foundation. He has authored formal testimony for dozens of US congressional hearings. He is widely published, including Emory Corporate Governance and Accountability Review Law Journal, The Hill, The National Interest, The Capital Weekly, The First Post, Swaraj, and so on. I can go on and on. He holds Juris Doctorate from Santa Clara University School of Law, and he's admitted to practice law before California State Bar and the US District Court for Central District of Columbia, which is a huge accomplishment. Mr. Kalra is going to share his thoughts about 1971 genocides in Bangladesh and the silence that the Western region or the Westerners have kept about it. So we are very delighted to have you with us today. And over to you, Mr. Kalra.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bhalerao, and thank you to the Indic Researchers Forum for organizing this very important event at a very critical time in today's world. Namaste, everyone. Good evening. It's my pleasure to be back again with the Indic Researchers Forum platform for another event. I had the pleasure of being with all of you earlier this year. And today I'm going to focus my remarks on the 1971 Bangladesh genocide in the context of the Western silence. Since I'm based in the US, I'm going to focus on the American role in that silence, both in terms of in the immediate aftermath of the genocide and during it in 1971, as well as through more contemporary times up until today. So I want to start with very briefly what happened in 1971. As we all probably know, the former East Pakistan declared independence from Pakistan in 1971, but it was a culmination of several long-standing factors, including linguistic and cultural repression, economic marginalization, political disenfranchisement, and a quest for greater provincial autonomy. Now, if we look at the actions of the West Pakistani military and civilian elite, even prior to the events of 1971, and since independence or the partition of the subcontinent, they were trying to create a cohesive polity that was unified by Islam and the Urdu language. So in that process, of course, the Bengali culture and language was viewed as a problem. Why? Because it was viewed as closely linked to Hinduism and therefore a threat to the conception of the Islamic nation. Now, of course, the two most immediate triggering points were the West Pakistan military and civilian elites' reaction to the Bhola cyclone that killed between 300 and 500,000 people, and the 1970 elections where the Pakistani military establishment refused to accept the victory of the Awami League. The independence movement in 1971 was met with a brutal genocidal campaign of violence by the Pakistani army and local Islamist militias. The conflict in total resulted in the massacre of an estimated 2 to 3 million East Pakistani citizens, primarily Hindus, the ethnic cleansing of 8 to 10 million ethnic Bengalis, many of whom, of course, a majority who fled to India. And very importantly, the rape of at least 200,000 women. And some estimates put that number at much higher and closer to 400,000. Now, that was what was very unique, in that rape was used as a weapon of war for probably one of the first times in contemporary genocides. There were, of course, incidents of sexual assault and rape in other genocides, whether in Cambodian genocide, whether the Rwandan genocide, Armenian, and others. But this is the first time it was used in recent history in a systematic manner and as a weapon of war. Hindus were the special targets of the violence in this genocide, and that's been clearly documented by official government correspondence, as well as documents, media reports from the United States, Pakistan, and India. Now, while Hindus were the special targets of violence, all Bengalis, regardless of their religious identity, were targeted. The Pakistani military's conflation of Hindu, Bengali, and Indian identities meant that all Bengali were suspect. A Bengali identity assumed a Hindu identity, which in turn assumed an Indian identity. There has been consensus amongst legal and academic scholars that during the Bangladesh Liberation War, the West Pakistani army committed acts of genocide against ethnic Bengalis, followed by acts of genocide against Hindus, both of which meet the legal criteria as organized, targeted, and systematic killing of national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups with the intent to destroy them in whole or in part. Now, there's no doubt that the West, and particularly the US, was aware of what was happening in 1971, and that the Nixon administration turned a blind eye to the genocide intentionally. The most prominent American official who started to ring the alarm bells about what was happening was the American Consul General and the US senior diplomat at the time in Dhaka, Archer Blood. And for those that haven't read the book, please, I would recommend read The Blood Telegram. It's a wonderful book by Gary Bass, which really details and documents a lot of the communications between Archer Blood in Bangladesh and to the US administration at that time, and really talks about the systematic nature of what was happening and the inaction by the US administration. And so he repeatedly warned government officials in Washington about the violence and particularly about the selective targeting of Hindus. And I want to give just a few examples of some of these cables and quote directly from them, because I think it's important to understand there was great clarity with which he was describing the events that were occurring and the way he was warning the officials. So in one of those diplomatic cables, Archer Blood said very clearly, genocide applies fully to naked, calculated, and widespread selection of Hindus for special treatment. From outset, various members of American community have witnessed either burning down of Hindu villages, Hindu enclaves in Dhaka, and shooting of Hindus attempting to escape carnage, or have witnessed after effects which are visible throughout Dhaka today. And there are dozens of these. So in another one, he goes on to note that the Pakistani military was engaged in the mass killing of unarmed civilians, the systematic elimination of the intelligentsia, and the annihilation of the Hindu population. Now, of course, despite this assessment, the Nixon administration continued to support the Pakistani regime, and in fact supported them. Now, the warnings actually were not limited to the Consul General Archer Blood. There were several reports from members of Congress, most notably the former Senator Edward Kennedy, as well as the US Ambassador to India at the time, Kenneth Keating, and even the CIA reported on what was happening there. And I again want to quote a couple of instances or examples of these reports. So from Edward Kennedy's report to the US Senate Judiciary Committee, he stated that nothing is more clear or more easily documented than the systematic campaign of terror and its genocidal consequences launched by the Pakistan Army on the night of March 25th. Field reports to the US government, countless eyewitness journalistic accounts, reports of international agencies such as the World Bank, and additional information available to the subcommittee document the continuing reign of terror which grips East Bengal. Hardest hit have been members of the Hindu community who have been robbed of their lands and shops, systematically slaughtered, and in some places painted with yellow patches marked H. All of this has been officially sanctioned, ordered, and implemented under martial law from Islamabad. America's heavy support of Islamabad is nothing short of complicity in the human and political tragedy of East Bengal. And I just want to read one more quote for you, and this is coming from the US Ambassador to India, Kenneth Keating. And this is talking about the flow of refugees into India. They're still coming at that time at 100,000 a day. The latest I heard was 150,000 a day because they're killing the Hindus. And the thing that in the beginning, these refugees were about in the proportion to the population, 85% Muslim, 15% Hindus. Because when they started the killing, it was indiscriminate. Now, having gotten control of the large centers, it is almost entirely a matter of genocide killing the Hindus. And the intellectual leaders, the leaders in the country that they want to get rid of, primarily these Awami League people, they've killed them. So as you can see, there is countless amounts of documentation that very clearly and unequivocally describes what occurred as genocide. It describes the scope and scale of what was happening. It clearly lays out the fact that while many Bengalis of all backgrounds were targeted, that Hindus were targeted for special treatment. And it also very clearly describes the flow of refugees into India. So the question is, if it was so clear and all these warnings were coming, why was there such systematic silence from the West, and particularly the US? And why was there complicity in the acts that happened in 1971 until today? So, of course, at that time, geopolitics influenced a lot of the US's response. The US, of course, had good relations with Pakistan. At the time, India was more clearly aligned with the Soviet Union. But I think it goes beyond that, and there's a deeper explanation for that. If we look at some of the declassified cables or conversations between President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, you can see that there was also a deep hatred for Hindus and for India. And this was represented or manifested in how they talked about then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. The language, the way that Nixon and Kissinger described her was very clear in that they had much more than just disdain for her, that they had hatred for her. And again, this was very clearly linked to what their general feelings were for India more broadly and for Hindus more specifically. And so there was a personality element to that and this view of India as well. And that also helped to influence a lot what was happening. Now, if we fast forward to after the actual genocide and actual liberation of Bangladesh, you can see that there were many opportunities along the way to actually get some recognition, to get some acknowledgement, formal apology, or even justice for what happened to the victims of the 1971 genocide. There was, in the 1974 tripartite agreement between Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, a clause where Pakistan had agreed to try 195 of their military officers for their role in the genocide. Of course, they never did, and they created some wiggle room in that and not having to pursue that. But the US could have played a role because of their strong relations with Pakistan to push that or force Pakistan to enforce that agreement and bring those officers to justice. If you look at beyond what was happening in Pakistan, there was no willingness or political will in the US to actually acknowledge that what had happened. Now, you compare that to how the US was involved in Rwanda, in Cambodia, and many other genocides of the 20th century. And at the minimum, they were involved in helping to host post-genocide tribunals, or to at least very clearly condemn what had happened and acknowledge the scope and scale of those genocides. But that didn't happen in the US. And if you look at how the US has reacted to this over the years, you can see that there's a clear pattern of denial. Now, if you again fast forward to the 2000s, you will look at the period of 2009 to about 2014, when Bangladesh itself tried to hold internal tribunals to hold the local collaborators, predominantly those that were involved in the Jamaat-e-Islami, accountable for their actions. So here was another perfect opportunity for the US to respond to that, to support those tribunals, and to hold some parties at least accountable for their actions. But instead, what did the US elected officials and government officials do? At every step, they undermined those tribunals. They pointed to technical flaws in the process instead of working with the Bangladeshi government to help correct those flaws and move the tribunals forward. In fact, they claimed that there was exaggerated evidence in those tribunals and that they were illegal under international law. And that was not by any stretch of the imagination their role independently, because what you also saw was a lot of lobbying, a lot of efforts by groups within the US Congress, for instance, to undermine those tribunals and to prevent US officials from speaking out on some of those issues. Now, it was a combination of things. One was there's a perception that if you do support the tribunals or you say anything about the genocide, you will be accused of being Islamophobic. And that was actually related in several personal conversations that I had with staffers on Capitol Hill in a number of meetings. And I'm sure my esteemed colleague here, Dr. Richard Benkin, can attest to some of that as well. And if you look at the lobbying that was done, both by Jamaat-e-Islami very directly in Congress, as well as through their proxy organizations, they hired some of the most prominent and the most expensive lobbying groups, including Cassidy and Associates, which is a very well-known lobbying group in the US. They did similar things in the United Kingdom as well. But again, I'm focusing here on the US. And in that lobbying, they were basically, again, undermining the tribunals. And they were able to shift the focus from the persecution, the history of the genocide, what was happening to religious minorities, to actually a conversation about suppression of democracy in Bangladesh, suppression of the opposition, and targeting of political opponents. So the narrative was completely shifted, and therefore any conversation of the genocide was marginalized. Any conversation of what was happening even in those decades subsequent to the genocide was marginalized, and it became a conversation about the Awami League and the flaws of the Awami League government. And we can see the repercussions of that today with the toppling of the Awami League government and the interim government and who is in power and his connection to the US government over the years. And so there has been a clear pattern and history of unwillingness, political reasons, as well as broader narratives in why the US has failed to acknowledge or force those countries or actors that were responsible for the genocide in Bangladesh to be held accountable. And I honestly, unfortunately, don't see things changing. Just a couple years ago, we worked with some offices in Congress to introduce a resolution, again, to recognize the genocide. After a couple of members of Congress signed on and were co-sponsor of it, the resolution was completely killed and sidelined. Again, why? Because people were scared to speak out on this issue for the optics of it and what it would present them as, again, being Islamophobic. So I don't see that changing, unfortunately. I don't see the dynamics within the government, whether it's in Congress, the State Department, or the other parts of the administration to actually hold those accountable, or at least to formally acknowledge what has happened in Bangladesh. If you look at another case study, you look at the Armenians. It took the Armenians decades for them to formally get a resolution to acknowledge the Armenian genocide. So we're still a long ways away from that. I think that we all have a role to play in continuing to push for acknowledgement of what happened in that genocide, because I think, as was said earlier, history clearly repeats itself and is repeating itself and will continue to repeat itself unless we all continue to speak up and raise these issues. And with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks for right now, and I'll, of course, be open to any questions that anybody has as we move to that discussion. Thank you.
Samirji, thank you so much. You bring a totally different perspective, being here in US and from US political and government perspective, how these things are perceived, rather not perceived, and what is being done or rather not being done. So we really appreciate you providing that insight. Appreciate your time. If you're in California, I think this is very, very early morning for you. So we appreciate you joining us.
Absolutely.
Okay. With that, we'll move on to our next and final speaker for today. The unique thing about the next speaker, Dr. Richard Benkin, is he is a humanitarian. He has fought, he has stood for Hindus, for Muslims, for any race and religion. Wherever he sees injustice, he stands up and represents human rights and supports different communities. He's a US patriot, and he has even freed a Muslim journalist who was imprisoned and tortured. So it is not just he's supporting only Muslims or only Hindus or only certain religions or certain communities, which is very, very special and unique about him. He also has stood against different attacks on Hindu temples, built a lot of evidences, provided a lot of evidences to government agencies and so on to bring justice. He's always standing for human rights and protesting any abuse that is against humanity. Extremely active. If I really have to talk about him, I can just keep talking about him for a long time. But I won't spend too much time. You can look up his LinkedIn profile or various articles and other things that are published by him. A true gentleman, true genuine person. And we are very, very fortunate to have him with us today. So with that, Dr. Benkin, without much ado, I'll hand over the mic to you. And please take off from here.
Thank you, Doctor. And namaskar to everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I want to focus on some of the challenges we're facing in trying to actually stop the violence, stop the ethnic cleansing, and how we can overcome those challenges. And by the way, although this wasn't baked into my initial comments, I feel very honored to follow Samir Kalra, who has been a true champion for many, many years. And I think a lot of the things that he said about our country, unfortunately, have been the case. And that's one of the challenges we have to overcome. Certainly, and I know Samir, I know he knows this, probably mentioned this. It's not just the United States. There's that kind of, call it ignorance or whatever else you want to call it, throughout, I think, the Western world, where too many people in the Western world look at Hindus as being just kind of different or not really like us, quote unquote, when of course that is very, very dangerous perspective that don't too many people have. So I want to focus on those challenges. So last month I spent a lot of time in West Bengal because the U.S. State Department put a do not travel advisory on Bangladesh. I got up to the border and I spent a good deal of time in Bangladesh, where a lot of people have families. I mean, I spent a lot of time in West Bengal, India. A lot of people have families inside Bangladesh who are experiencing the atrocities. But it was interesting that shortly before I left, I got an email from an organization. I won't mention the name of this organization. And they said, well, given what's happening in Bangladesh, we want to have a seminar on it, and we'd like you to be our key speaker. Sure. I mean, obviously, I agreed to that, but then went on to do what I had to do. Now, interestingly, when I was in India, I got a follow-up email from this group. I'm going to quote, well, I'm going to read what they said. This is what the email said that I received. Since Bangladesh seems to have calmed down and the issues aren't as urgent as initially depicted, we won't be speaking about Bangladesh. Calm down? Have they lost their minds? I'm sure the far too many victims of these atrocities wouldn't agree with that and call me crazy. But I always figured when people's lives are at stake, there's nothing more urgent than that. And of course, that is exactly what we're talking about for Hindus in Bangladesh. This should help us, all of us, identify one of the most serious dangers we face in the struggle to actually do something to stop this carnage. And that is how easily even knowledgeable people can move on to the next hot topic without doing anything to resolve the issue of ethnic cleansing in Bangladesh, and in many cases, not even starting to do anything to resolve these issues. And by the way, I use the term ethnic cleansing very deliberately when it comes to Bangladeshi Hindus, because I believe everyone here understands that the goal of our enemies is to cleanse Bangladesh of its Hindu population utterly and completely. Some have been very open about that. Others are a little more circumspect, but they all want the same thing. They want Bangladesh to be free of Hindus. Well, nothing between the two emails that I received from that organization, by the way, ever did happen to change the moral imperative of standing up for Hindus in Bangladesh. And that brings us to another point that we have to remember, that we might know, again, with a lot of these things, we might know this, but this is something that a lot of people don't, especially the people that say that Dr. Kalra and I will go to see in Washington, and I'm sure others do as well. Very important point. They might not understand this. And that is this: the atrocities, the anti-Hindu atrocities that followed the August coup in Bangladesh were nothing new. They're nothing that hadn't been going on for decades. But that means if we accept that ignorance, if we treat it as something new, or as a mere byproduct of the post-coup chaos, then we miss the point. But more importantly, we miss an opportunity to actually do something about this. And we miss an opportunity to help these innocent victims of hatred. Now, once we get people's attention, making things even more challenging, again, this is something we have to remember too, is that pretty much, let's say almost every major stakeholder in Bangladesh, I don't care how they fashion themselves or posture themselves as pro-minority or some such stuff like that, because almost every stakeholder, major stakeholder in Bangladesh has patronized radical Islamists in that country and given them some legitimacy. Okay, so I want to repeat that. Almost anyone you're going to be talking to on the other side of the table in Bangladesh has dirty hands in this, is somehow complicit. And we can't forget that. We got to remember, because if we then give them, give them some legitimacy, perhaps we're legitimizing the violence that's still occurring. So they've all been part of this. And in fact, this new government that's supposed to be committed to bringing about a democratic Bangladesh, they have Islamists in it. They've appointed Islamists in their government. And so much for any thought that Bangladesh is going to be democratic at any point. We can never make the mistake of letting up on our pressure, or thinking, I'll give them a little time and maybe they'll come around. They've had more than a half a century to come around and they haven't. Something else we have to keep in mind when we're engaging in these sorts of conversations and activism. It may be clear to us that this is a genocide, that this is a terrible thing, that in the name of humanity must stop. We have to remember that those of us, and those of us who work with Washington, New Delhi, and other capitals know this. Most of the people we look to, lawmakers, they don't know that. They don't understand that. And besides that, they get dozens of worthy causes across their desks every day. This problem with a constituent, this ethnic cleansing, this bigotry, et cetera, et cetera. They get dozens of these things every day. Our challenge is people who need to stand up for the Hindus in Bangladesh. Our challenge is to make sure that our cause is somehow distinguished from the other worthy causes they get, because they only have so much capital to devote to these causes. So it's why is ours different? And another thing that I try is also to show them, again, this doesn't matter if it's in Washington, New Delhi, or London, or anywhere else. Our challenge is to show them why it's important to them and their constituents. So for instance, when I talk to lawmakers, I try and tie what's happening in Bangladesh to the much greater global struggle that's happening today between those nations that stand behind democracy and those that stand behind authoritarianism. And this is very much a part of that. We know that if Islamists or people who patronize Islamists come to power in Bangladesh, chances of democracy are in the toilet. And they're just going to move closer and closer to China and help them try and complete that string of pearls of ports around India. So again, that's our challenge. The other thing to remember is, if the issue of Bangladeshi Hindus is not going to be relegated to the when I get around to it basket that everyone seems to have, the only people who can prevent that is us. Repeat again. It's not, well, maybe someone will come to our rescue. Maybe this government or that government's going to all of a sudden stand up for a cause they've ignored for decades. No, the only people that are going to change it are us. If we don't change it, no one will. If we don't find it important enough to get off our duffs, go to the capitals, and push, who will? We don't care enough to get up and have groups picketing or giving out leaflets to large employers or large retailers that buy masses of Bangladeshi goods. Well, if we don't do it, who's going to? I remember one congressman back in the day telling me, I went to him and I talked about Bangladeshi Hindus. And he said to me, Richard, we all believe you. We know you wouldn't be telling us this if you hadn't, confirmed it yourself. So we do believe you, but we got to ask you, if this is so dire, if the situation is so bad for Hindus in Bangladesh, why are we not hearing anything from our Hindu constituents? Now, hopefully they're hearing a little more today, but that was a big issue. I tried to position it to, look, this is a worthy cause, no matter who's bringing it up. But the fact is, again, it really does shine a light on, it has to be us. It has to be us. Now, I want to pivot a little bit because I want to talk about something that we Jews do. We have a word among us. The word is hasbara, which essentially refers to teaching others about us, giving non-Jews good information and insights to counter the bad information and the bigotry and the hatred they otherwise would be getting from a variety of sources. And within that concept of hasbara, there's an obligation that every single Jew has an obligation to seize the opportunity to do hasbara when it's presented. And I urge that same action and thinking for the many Hindus. I think it'd be a great thing because, again, as we heard from Dr. Kalra, most people in the West, they don't understand. And I haven't seen that kind of hasbara, except I got to tell you, his organization, the Hindu American Foundation, is about the only organization I've seen that does that kind of hasbara for Hindus, that sort of Hindu hasbara. And I'm sure he could tell you much better than I can. the challenges they face, the ignorance and bigotry, which, by the way, that's another thing. This Hindu Hasbara that the Hindu American Foundation engaged in, and which we Jews engage in, it not only exposed the outright hatred which exists, but I think more insidiously what it is, I'll call it the casual Hindu phobia. That is bigotry, persecution, or bigotry of Hindus based not on hatred, but just on ignorance. And certainly as an American Jew, I mean, as a Jew, I certainly am familiar with that sort of challenge. And but that is something I would urge. You got to take every opportunity to let people know about the beauty, the wonder of Hinduism, what Hinduism means to world civilization, or just what's happening to poor innocent Hindus inside Bangladesh. Okay, so what do we do? And again, this is kind of the world in which I live. What do we do? Well, here's what I want to focus on. The fact is, so let's say we do all the right things. We keep this issue in the public eye. And there are a number of people, maybe not the 435 members of the U.S. House, but perhaps more than just Raja Krishnamurti and Sri Tenadar, probably some others now, understand that this is an issue we got to do something about. Well, I'm here to tell you that as citizens of the United States and India, I'll throw India in here too, there's a lot our countries can do, a ton, more than people will let on. And because the other thing that we learn is if you want to get people to do something, you got to know their pressure points. You got to know where you can push that's going to hurt. So, so for instance, we know that, well, okay, let me start this way. The August coup in Bangladesh really was not about, you know, government job reservations or about Sheikh Hasina's autocratic rule. Those things, both of those things have been going on for years and years and years. That's not what happened. That's not what actually caused the riots. That might have been the proximate cause. What caused the problem is this. Bangladesh for several years experienced what has to be called an economic miracle. Its GDP growth far outstripped that of most large countries with populations of that size. And so economically, the country is doing well. And I think all of us, whether we're citizens of the United States, of India, or of any other country, when people's bellies are full, when people can see a future for their children, and things are kind of going all right, they're going to ignore a whole lot. They're going to put up with a whole lot. That's why, by the way, with all the issues that we could be having in our current presidential election here in the United States, consistently and without exception, the top issue that voters say they're concerned about is always the economy and inflation, always. So that's the pressure point, because it experienced that economic miracle, and people put up with whatever crap Sheikh Hasina and the others gave them. But several months or so before the coup itself, that economic miracle stopped. The economy started moving in the wrong direction. And the high inflation that economic miracle brought, but which people could deal with since they were making money themselves, well, now that inflation became a serious issue because the economy wasn't hot. And it was an even more serious issue if you were among the millions who were losing their jobs. So the fact is, whoever emerges as the leader of Bangladesh, whether it's the Islamists, whether it's a democratic faction, I got to put democratic in quote, or even if it's the Awami League coming back, whoever emerges is going to have to fix that economy, get the people jobs and food, or else they're going to be replaced with another coup in pretty short order. And we can take that to the bank. So whatever we hear publicly, we know that we know that those factions are going to be concerned with how do we fix the Bangladeshi economy. And that brings us back to what we can do. We know that for many years, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been building a strong relationship with Bangladesh. And it's a relationship that's underlined by economics. We know that India has become Bangladesh's #1 trading partner, besides the fact that India actually holds the levers to most of Bangladesh's potable water and other things that are critical. That makes India really, really important to Bangladesh. We might have seen a lot of Bangladeshis after the coup spewing anti-India hatred. That's all noise. Just let it go. What the governments, whoever it may be, know is that they need India if they're going to fix their economy. Secondly, we also know that Bangladesh's economy is inordinately dependent on one thing. And what's that one thing? It's the export of ready-made garments and textiles. That is the key to their economy. And you know who their best customer is? The United States. Which means if the United States stop buying Bangladeshi goods, they're in big trouble. By the way, the second biggest customer is Germany. That's another Western democracy that I'm sure we could, if we actually did something, if my country actually did something, could probably get Germany to join too. So that's critical. And again, everyone knows that. When some years back, when I was dealing with the Bangladeshi government about the growing influence of the Chinese Communist Party, and I was putting some pressure on, they said, well, if you're going to be that way, we'll just get closer to China. My response was, you go right ahead, because China's your biggest competitor. We're your biggest customer. Now you tell me who anyone with any sense is going to want to cozy up to. So remember, we have a lot of leverage with Bangladesh. Secondly, the other thing that Bangladesh is dependent on, its economy is dependent on the millions of dollars, not rupees, not taka, the millions of dollars it gets every single month by being the largest supplier of UN peacekeeping personnel. Also critical for their economy. But then step back a minute. Who funds that program far more than anyone else? The United States. So my point in bringing these things up is that the United States and India have a great deal of leverage with Bangladesh if our countries have the will to actually use it. So for instance, and this is the kind of thing that I like to talk about with people in Washington, said to Bangladesh that unless it stops the ethnic cleansing of Hindus, we're going to put a large tariff on their goods. Now, a couple of years ago, that might have had so much of an impact. You say that to Bangladesh, and let's not forget, and I'm sure they're not going to forget, and if they do, we'll remind them, the odds-on favorite to become president again in just 10 days and be inaugurated in January. That president, let's remember, has never been shy about using tariffs and American economic might in international relations. And Bangladesh needs to know that too. It's not just some guy saying to them, we're going to put a tariff. What the heck does that mean? But in fact, we've got someone who'll probably become president again, who will do that if someone gets to him in the right way. And I don't think Bangladesh wants to afford that. What if we said to the United Nations, we will not provide financial support to a country providing peacekeepers when they can't keep peace in their own country? What if we say we just find the ethnic cleansing of Hindus? Again, remember, I keep using that phrase, ethnic cleansing. It's not persecution, because they want all Hindus out of that country. But what if we say we just morally we can't send money to a country that's engaged in that ethnic cleansing? I will say a couple things. I do, in general, I absolutely agree with Dr. Kalra that I don't see attitudes in my country changing. I think he did a great job of showing how we viewed everything through the prism of the Cold War back in the day in 1971, and therefore threw our chips in with Pakistan rather than with the Bangladesh, and in stopping the attempted genocide. So I agree. The beacon of hope that I see, where things can change, and it's a little, it's kind of a bit cynical. The fact is that every year the Hindu diaspora in the United States grows and grows, and it's actually growing faster right now, I think, than the Muslim population of the country. Not only that, you know, we have more Hindus in Congress, in the administration, and in other places, that I believe politicians who want to get reelected, again, excuse me, I'm being very cynical, maybe they don't want to mess around with alienating the Hindu vote. And so, and especially in certain localities, you know, that gives the Hindu diaspora a little more clout, much more clout in Washington than it had before. Again, I'm sure Dr. Kalra and the Hindu American Foundation, you know, they live this every day and kind of know the reality better enough. But I have found that people are more willing to respond. I'll give you an example. Right now, there's an election for the U.S. Senate in the state of Wisconsin, just north of me. The incumbent senator, Democratic Tammy Baldwin, some months ago introduced this horrible anti-India resolution in the Senate. Now, I've been fighting it. I'm sure I'm not the only one. And so I won't take credit. I don't want to take credit for anything. But there's not a single other senator who has been a co-sponsor. And I know her people tried hard in my state because we have two very liberal senators. And I guess she figured that she could get them to be co-sponsors. But we worked hard and we stopped that. She hasn't had a single co-sponsor. And now, although she's probably, if I had to bet, I'd bet she'd get reelected. She's in a much tougher race than she thought was, in part, not entirely, but in part because of her Hindu-phobic resolution. So I think that we have an opportunity to really do something here. Bangladesh is vulnerable. I'll give you another example. Again, I'll go back to the Jewish community. In the 1980s, you couldn't drive around the United States without seeing a banner in front of a synagogue that said "Free Soviet Jewry." We had problems. I mean, our co-religionists, were being persecuted terribly in the Soviet Union. And we realize, just as I hope we all realize here, if anyone's going to stop that, it's going to be us. We're the only people who, and if we don't care enough to stop it, no one else will. And so we lobbied Congress, and we fought, and we fought. And ultimately, we got 1.2 million Jews out of that communist hell. And let's remember, we were fighting the mighty Soviet Union. What are we talking about here? Bangladesh. Bangladesh can't hold it, you know, can't come anywhere close to the import and the strength that the Soviet Union had back in the 80s. So there's plenty we can do. It's vulnerable. Its economy is on a razor's edge. You screw them up with 1, 2, 3 issues, and they're dead. And there'll be another. So this is what we can do. Let me be clear, by the way. I'm not saying this because I want to see more hardship on the Bangladeshi people. That's not the point. I'm urging these actions, so we don't have to feel guilty about this. We're not putting people out of a job. I urge these actions because I know that the leaders of Bangladesh, whoever they may be, after the current military regime, recognizes that it can't allow these things to happen. We saw a little example of what happens when Morsi took over Egypt after the Arab Spring. And he put ideology in front of the people's needs. And of course, he found himself out in his butt too. So they know that they got to do these things. So what we have to do is we have to push our lawmakers. We have to push our lawmakers and others into taking action. We can't be concerned about other people thinking, well, they're not really polite. They're not being a nice person. You know how many millions of people think I'm horrible and say so on social media? I don't care. What is that stacked up against the horrible, terrible things that are being done to people, the Hindus of Bangladesh, to the rapes, the murders, the destructions of mandirs and other religious desecration? And we've all heard about it. Many of us have seen it. We can't worry about what people think of us, whether people like us or not. That means nothing. That means nothing. The moral imperative is to do something to stop this. And again, the only way to stop it is to put pressure where the pressure is going to hurt. And in this case, we're talking about India's economic clout with Bangladesh, and we're talking about the United States' economic clout with Bangladesh, in particular, our funding of peacekeeping, and our being Bangladesh's #1 customer. And we've seen this working, by the way. We've seen this. And first of all, Bangladesh, as many of us know, in Bangladesh, every year, Hindus experience massive anti-Hindu pogroms, attacks on communities and individuals during Durga Puja. This is a critical time. And our enemies got ready for it. They did this deliberately, just the way October 7th was on the Jewish holiday of Simchas Torah. You know, the same enemies. They're on Durga Puja. Excuse me. That was so bad. And it got so horrible in 2021 that even the international media, which are reliably silent about this atrocity, even they had to write about it. That's how bad it was. So after that, I said, well, we can't let that happen again. And I was in Bangladesh more than I would care to say, talking about what we can do to their garment purchases or the peacekeeping money if they don't do something to stop these things in Durga Puja 2022. And you know what? They did. I had enough information from people on the ground. They sent their police out. They let the people know that they would prosecute. And we didn't have that on Durga Puja 2022. And in Durga Puja 2023, we did it again. This time, Raja Krishnamurti also got involved. And it didn't happen again. This year, we were a little concerned because the government doesn't have a whole lot of abilities and power. Stopped it again. And why did we stop? Because they were concerned about the consequences, the harm to their economy, if in fact these things happen, and we took action. So if we have the will, if we take action, we can actually move the needle. And even if we can't solve the huge problem with everything we do, each time we do, we're saving lives. And we're letting the Bangladeshi Hindus know they are not alone, that there are people all over the world, Hindus and non-Hindus, who will stand up for them and put themselves in harm's way if needed to protect them. I will ask everyone here, I will end by asking everyone here the question I ask anytime I speak about this issue. When this is over, and when you walk out the door of wherever you are, what are you going to do about this? Are you going to take action? Are you going to organize with others? Are you part of organizations that can do this? Are you going to be strong with your elected leaders and let them know that this is important to determine what kind of vote you cast in the next election? Are you going to go to retailers that sell Bangladeshi goods and make a noise about boycotting them, or don't use the word boycott, that's a terrible word, about not buying them from them. If there's a Bangladeshi businessman who comes to your country or your city who wants to talk about how great it is to do business in Bangladesh, be there. Be there, make noise. Don't let him breathe. Don't let him get a word in edgewise until people know what's being done to Hindus in Bangladesh. You know, it drives me nuts that all over the world, people are getting out in the streets for terror supporting people in Gaza who've committed atrocities themselves. And they're getting up and getting all exercise about that, but they haven't said a word about the innocent Hindus in Bangladesh. Now, if that's not a crazy world, I don't know what is. But we can change that. But we can only change that if we care enough to take action. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Benkin. I really appreciate all the insights you provide. And also the way you spoke, your passion shows. And you're passionate, as I said in the beginning, in general about humanity. And that's awesome. We really appreciate that. Namaste. We are coming to the end of this session. We had a pretty intense session, lot of discussion, lot of information shared. We are also running against time. We have few questions. I wanted to recap some of my thoughts about wonderful session we had, starting with Dr. Nalapat, followed by Professor Bhattacharjee, Mr. Kalra, and then finally with Dr. Benkin. But in the interest of time, we'll just go over some of the questions that we have. So I'll hand it over back to Samir to communicate those questions and let the panelists address those questions. Over to you, Samir.
Thank you, Mr. Bhalerao. With this, we have come to the end of the last session of Bangladesh at Crossroads, Dhaka's Bringing Regional Security. I thank all the speakers, Professor Madhavdas Nalapat, Professor Ayon Bhattacharjee, Mr. Samir Kalra, and Dr. Richard Benkin, along with the session chair, Mr. Parag Bhalerao, sir, for joining us today for this insightful session. Lastly, we have also come to the end of our conference, and I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all the esteemed speakers and session chairs for making this conference successful. Stay tuned to our social media accounts to get future updates on our upcoming projects. The recording of all the sessions will be uploaded on our YouTube channel in the next 72 hours. The links to the channel is shared in the chat box. Also, all the participants who have attended all 3 sessions will be receiving a participation certificate, further details of which are also present in the chat box. Once again, on behalf of Indic Researchers Forum, I thank you all for joining the conference today. We wish you all a very happy Deepavali and holidays ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day and good night.